remain committed, but there are no policies yet that are developed by this government of national unity. And if there's something that we find totally unacceptable or offensive, we can always exit.
Now, despite 3 decades of market-friendly policies aimed at investment-led growth in the country, GDP per capita has been stagnated. In fact, this year, the World Bank says we're going to grow by 0.6%. Now, to respond to this setback, there is an urgent call to address the failures in the redistributive policies that perpetuate inequality and hinder national progress. To expand more on this, I'm joined now by economist Nthabiseng Moleko from the Stellenbosch Business School. Nthabiseng, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for your time. From where I sit, post these elections, the message is very clear from the electorate. In addition to that, no party has won an outright majority. The majority, or the biggest chunk of the voters, voted for transformation. So in the way of going forward, if we are going to change the status quo, there is a need for new transformative strategies. Am I wrong?
Absolutely correct. I think the very first thing we've got to heed is that we've had the labour force survey results come out today confirming the crisis that we have. 12 million South Africans remain unemployed. Now, with 12 million South Africans outside of the economic activity and participation, what this says is that the majority of South Africans from a household sector level are actually outside of economic participation. I think the second concern, Dan, is that the majority of SMMEs in all the economic sectors are highly excluded in that we have issue of concentration and market dominance, which is prevalent across retail, across plastics, across manufacturing, across farming. You've got the duality situation in the market structure of most of South African economic sectors. And what this simply says is that SMMEs, simply put, cannot compete on price and also in terms of longevity in the different economic sectors. So what it says is that what must be done to enhance transformation so that we have a growing economy, a healthy and a vibrant economy, an economy that enables the majority of South Africans to participate. And I think this is an urgent thing that must be addressed as a matter of priority. I think 1994 was a time when we looked at the political liberation of the people of South Africa. But I think now we've come to the point where the economic liberation of the people has to enter into the fore. And the discussions around restoration of the country has to look at the economic cluster, the institutions around the economic cluster, the capacity of the state, the meritocracy in the state, and the alignment of both the public and the private sector towards national development goals, where everyone is actually a beneficiary of the South African abundance.
Yeah, so when you look at what you've just said, a number of things would have to change. I mean, policies, maybe a tweaking of 1 or 2 policies, approach, and the role of the private sector as well.
So it's not a policy approach perspective. I think it's a prioritization perspective. And I think what we have seen with the results of the investment-led FDI, particularly the emphasis on the investment-led and market-friendly policies, is that the markets haven't sufficiently yielded the benefit to the majority of the population. How do we see this? We see this in the inclusivity. You measure it by Gini index. You measure it by household consumption. You measure this through the level of disposable income and the participation through employment and through economic activity across all the sectors. So policy imperative has to be reformed. That is number one. We have to have a redistributive growth path. So what we have seen now is that we just emphasize growth. We don't necessarily emphasize how growth must be inclusive, underline inclusive. So the redress aspect, triple BE, and also land and factors of production, which are very sore points in our economic discourse, where we simply say, let's continue with things as is, and we hope for the best if growth happens. Unfortunately, the instruments that we need to employ now and deploy for South Africa is to show how these factors of production can actually be shared to the majority of the populace. So in Africa, you will see that the average growth rate has been around 4 or 5%. A lot of countries, resource and non-resource intensive countries, are seeing 5, 5.5, 6, 6.5% growth rates. South Africa is sitting at a 0.1 contraction in the last quarter. Last year and the previous years On average, we're seeing around 1.5% if we are lucky. This cannot be the case. And the reason for this is because the majority of our people are not in the economic participation, particularly your youth, your black women, and particularly when you look at 7 of the 9 provinces that have been outside of the economic fray, and I'll mention them: Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Free State. Gauteng actually is on the brink. The only 2 provinces that you see which are seeing some kind of economic activity because of management and also, I think, historical economic infrastructure and emphasis are your Western Cape and Gauteng. But everywhere else, you're not seeing that abundance trickle to the people. So you cannot hope for the best. You've actually got to just deliberately employ some of these economic instruments through the economic cluster, through development finance institutions, through disciplining capital. And this you can do simply through regulation and encouraging, particularly with the financial services sector charter and other tools that are at the employ of the DTIC transformation. And I think it is mandatory for us to have this discussion because the economic liberation has to be the thing that we discuss now in the next 30 years of South Africa's economic story.
Hopefully it will be a key item on the agenda of the national dialogue that everybody is now talking about and that it is necessary, all the new political parties. As you are talking there, I'm thinking we hear a lot about how market-friendly policies are necessary. We've seen the gears of this world. We've seen the Asgisas of this world. We have an NDP which has got a deadline of 2030. I don't think we'll achieve any of the goals that were set out there at this stage, judging by where we are and the impact of all sorts of challenges, including the recent pandemic. But we also hear about the need for public-private partnership. But the capital sector, the business sector is not investing in our economy. In fact, it's hoarding capital.
So the reports that we are seeing, there's a measure that you can assess in terms of capital inflows. So there's 2 that you can particularly focus on, is the FDI inflows as a portion of GDP. We've seen contraction from last year to the previous year. And also, we have also seen private sector investment in the form of gross fixed capital formation in the last 5 to 10 years plummeting from around 18% to GDP now to the lowest level, not pre, but also post-apartheid, 12% of GDP. What that is saying is that markets are retaining profits, retaining dividends, retaining income. And what it's saying is that aspect of investing into machinery, equipment, purchasing equipment and land and so forth, which business is supposed to be doing once they make benefits from the economy and make gains, from consumption, and the people of South Africa and the people that are having income in the land and they're deriving benefits, whether you look at the big conglomerates in the financial sector, whether you look at the big conglomerates in retail, and all the economic sectors. Dividends are being declared. Is their money being reinvested? No. So what the CCRED report is saying is that the retaining of that capital, that withholding of that capital, it does translate to what we call an investment strike. What is unfortunate is that the effect of this investment strike is that the economic activity of key sectors is not there. We're not seeing growth in sectors that are actually having surpluses in terms of income flow actually growing in the South African economy. We expect the investment summits that the president hosts to come in with foreign capital and foreign inflows, yet we, as South African companies in the markets, are not reinvesting. There's a problem there. So I think this is now where regulation and I think serious discussions have to take place with the industry bodies, your BUSAs, your BLSAs, all the associations where big business is sitting. I think the government with the private sector, and when you talk about triple Ps, there's got to be cooperation. There's got to be a give and take. And I think that this give and take cannot only come from government. We expect good governance from the government, its entities. We expect efficiency from the government. We expect clean audits from the government. Let's also expect investment from the private sector. Let's also expect reinvestment and a cooperation from the private sector. It cannot be one-sided. So what you've seen in Japan, in Asian economies, there was a good willingness, I'd say out of goodwill, out of building the national good, out of building the national development plan of those countries, the private sector cooperated with the state to reinvest in key economic sectors. And this is key. Industrialization cannot happen without banks coming to the fore. Manufacturing cannot grow without banks putting money on the table. It cannot happen without market access to those who are excluded. And this is the cooperation South Africa desperately needs. It will not happen by force. It's got to be a willingness. And so I think the appeal is that when you have the grand coalition discussions, the cooperation has to be equally from the private sector and the public. The public-private partnerships are not one-sided, Dan. They've got to be two-sided, and they've got to come from the private sector in terms of reinvestment, but also opening market access and also enabling capital flows to where it's needed most. So I think these are some of the issues that haven't been discussed and have to come to the table, and we have to have hard discussions about what needs to be done to reform. Because the regulatory aspect, where you now start disciplining capital by forcing investment in sectors, that is not necessarily the route that one wants to go. But if we want growth from 0.1 or negative 0.1 to 6%, where South Africa should be, in fact, we've targeted 5.4% in the National Development Plan. And we're nowhere near, and we know why.
Yeah, it's a very important point as we conclude you're making there, Nthabiseng. If you look at the likes of Egypt, which has had a fair share of governance issues, I mean, they are growing at a far bigger rate than us as a country. And over the last 30 years, we seem to have regressed economic-wise compared to some of our peers on our continent. Thank you very much for your time and analysis. Economist Nthabiseng Moleko from the Stellenbosch.